So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for the wonderful idea to bring me here again after a couple of years of absence from Poland. So my contribution to the theme of our discussion will consist in an essay to reframe the solidarity question by transposing it into the matrix of a general theory of domestication. Unfortunately, I don't have enough time to develop the basics of this domestication problems. I just want to give a short hint to the fact that Plato's political ideas were not only metaphorically but also substantially rooted in a huge political pastorale. So shepherding is a key concept of his political philosophy. And there was a second context of discovery of this question in the late 19th century when Nietzsche, in the context of a post-Darwinian reflection, rediscovered the problem of domestication, but this time in a critical mode when he began to polemize against the priestly way of domesticating humanity. And in the middle, we have this 2,000 years long history of Christian pastorale, in which the image of the Good Shepherd has profoundly shaped European souls. But I have to jump over these basic reflections, and I go immediately to the special contributions that the 20th century, especially the anthropology of the 20th century, had to make to that problem by making a new description of the conditio humana that stems from the insight that the categories of evolutionary theory are no longer enough to describe domestication, either for pets in general, nor for the king of pets, of human being. You should hear, maybe, you should have in mind that famous quotation from the third part of the third section of Spoke Zarathustra, when he said, the human beings have made the wolf a dog and man himself man's best domestic animal. The king of pets, the human being. Sequences of generations who followed a trend to domestications are not subject to the usual pressure of selection of a purely natural environment. They benefit from a special semi-natural, semi-culturally created climate in which it is not necessarily those who are best adapted to external nature or the pressure of nature who survive, but rather those members of the species who best adapt to the internal relationships. These are the creatures who stand out for a special agility, for an enhanced ability to learn, for superior sociability, and finally for their prime bioaesthetic qualities. Because there's a deep suspicion that human beings have become more beautiful in the course of time. So this is not true for all and everybody, but the general trend is certainly leading to that point. There's some islands in the world where they seem to make a perverse experiment to find out how far you can go in ugliness in order to keep the procreation process going. But besides this island aesthetics, I would say humanity in general is becoming more and more also biologically, aesthetically attractive. But this is speculation, and I would like to come back to the anthropological truth. And there is a prelude to that in natural history with the creatures that build nests, especially birds, not to mention various reptiles such as the well-known Mexican salamander, the famous axolotl, which throughout its life retains its larval form. Then there are specifically those mammals that are able to offer their offspring a high standard of nest safety and brood care. Among such creatures, biologists have discerned a complex of characteristics that, since the late 19th century, has been denoted as neoteny. Also neoteny, which literally means the fixation of juvenile characteristics, sometimes even fetal characteristics. In another tradition, that was called paidomorphism or pedomorphism. The tendency to bring the term of the point of birth forward should be considered in the same group of phenomena as it leads to the birth of exceptionally immature young creatures. We find all these tendencies concentrated in Homo sapiens, whose offspring are characterized by the time of birth of exceptional immaturity. The fact that humans are per se born prematurely, so the reading by Adolf Portmann from the mid-20th century onwards not only means that the juvenile phase in the human life cycle is unusually prolonged. Portmann literally spoke of menschliche Frühgeburtlichkeit. This is so early natality is the precise term. It even leads to the paradoxical effect that the biologically speaking adult examples of a species die out, while the premature, the larval or fetal forms gain a monopoly in reproduction. As long ago as the 1920s, Louis Bulck, the Dutch paleoanthropologist, whom we have to thank for these dramatic insights, formulated the truth about Homo sapiens in terms of evolutionary theory, that it constitutes a species of culturally and biologically successful primate fetuses who, despite their juvenilization, indeed fetalization, constitute a species capable of reproduction. These brief remarks on the neotenic condition of human being go hand in hand with the third discovery on human domestication, which imbues the two preceding discoveries with new meaning. The lifting of the mystery of neoteny underscores the insight by cultural anthropologists that humans must from elementary stages onward be considered as cultural beings. The fundamental cultural nature of humans is henceforth to be seen in a double light. Firstly, cultures signify the continuation of a biological nesting privilege with human, that is, civilization's means. And in this context, domestication means moving neither into the house of reason, as it was the case in Plato, nor into the house of civilization, that was at the center of Nietzsche's concerns, but the gradual transformation of the safety of the nest into architectural security and socio-technical privileges. And since then, we have discerned with greater clarity that culture as a whole functions like a comprehensive incubator which embraces its members. Cultures are incubators that tolerate high degrees of immaturity inside and that have to create some people that are capable to carry the weight of the world if they have to step out. This is what sometimes was called the Cossack phenomenon, because the Russian troops at the border of the Russian Empire were constituted out of individuals like Russian cowboys. They were able to live all the time outside and take care for the security of the homeland. And on the other hand, in this sense, all cultures are solidarity systems, and all solidarity systems are communities that protect their members. On the other hand, these considerations show that Homo sapiens depends on cultural control mechanisms down to its innermost drives. Following the reduction in purely biological orientation programs, that is the product of humans' extreme neoteny, Homo sapiens has to offset the losses that it has sustained through the lack of internal direction by systems of instinct, and the loss of a firm linkage of environment and human brain. This compensation is achieved by means of systems of symbolic direction, or simply by culture. And the systems of symbolic order relieve all young humans of the task they will never manage to master alone, namely of generating from within themselves the experiences and inventions of their ancestors. In the next section, I deal with what I call naive pacifism and the refusal to cooperate in borderline situations of culture. The above remarks should have explained, albeit very roughly, why members of the species Homo sapiens have always, as such, constituted the products of autodomestication. Biologically, owing to their neotenization, culturally, thanks to their inclusion in self-generated symbolic orders, ethnically, given their membership of organic systems of solidarity. As a result of the synergy of all three aspects, cultures initially and usually comprise closed survival units in which the individuals are kept as if in artificial enclosures or incubators. This is the state of affairs that is sometimes described with the metaphor of Menschenpark that created a kind of turmoil a couple of years ago in a German public debate. It becomes clear in the light of these considerations that self-domestication is a concept that summarizes the human race's past. The fact that Homo sapiens exists despite being a biological impossibility is a mystery that can only be understood in terms of an anthropology of domestication. At the same time, we are faced by the concern that the methods of domestifying, taming and communalizing man have to date evidently been insufficient. If we look at the task of a higher pedagogic of the species, we immediately see that the task of civilization has only been half completed. If domestication seems to be a fait accompli in some respects, this by no means signifies that the work of civilizing is complete. It is easy to see why. Within their internal solidarity systems, cultures may respect domestic order, but in their external relations, domesticity remains incomplete, as the individual cultures initially and usually by no means exist under a single roof. Instead, they form mutually alien, not rarely uncanny and inimical environments. And the historical trace of the residual non-domesticity in human external relations is war, which has practically determined the species' entire historical existence. And for the latent possibility of war, and forever the latent possibility of war is reflected in the history of xenophobias. So if we define cultures as units capable of waging war, then we have a concept at hand that enables us to understand how non-domesticity casts its shadow over the inner relations in cultures. To the extent that successful cultures are always preparing war, their members can never feel really safe, even from within the protection of their own homes. Anyone wishing to overcome the poisoning of domestic life by preparing for a war with the outside world must therefore think about how to extend domestication beyond the scope of the older ethnic units of solidarity. And we can find elements of this insight above all in early Buddhism, in Stoicism, and in early Christianity. All three doctrines of wisdom, they have very often been misunderstood as religions, because I must warn you, in my opinion, there are no religions at all. Religion is a false terminus technicus that should be dropped because it creates that much misunderstanding of the reality of inner and outer behavior of human beings that it would really a blessing for the community of all those interested in the question to give up this fatal term and to study the material itself. And the material is nothing else but training. The man is a training phenomenon, and religion is a misconcept for training, a false concept for training. So in the future we shall have combinations between sportsmen and priests. That will lead forward. So in my next chapter I speak about a strange phenomenon called maximum stress cooperation in cultural groups. We now understand that the individual cultures function as primary domesticators by granting their members the protection of their symbolic and material orders. It is likewise now evident why the domesticators initially and usually cannot themselves be domesticated. They continue to take their cue from the emergencies of non-domesticity, the life and the death struggle with aliens from other culture. And with a view to these conditions, we can redefine the phenomenon of culture. And in everyday speak, it is not unjustifiable, often equated with the notion of a people. Culture as a symbolically integrated population whose members cooperate with one another, not only in domestic situations, but also in situations where it is a matter of a life and death struggle. Cultures thus constitute real operating survival units, or to use the words of Heiner Mühlmann, a German philosopher and cultural anthropologist, they constitute maximum stress cooperation groups. And this definition offers the advantage of highlighting why the most successful cultures are, as a rule, both the most domesticated and the most bellicose. The prime example of this in the Western culture world are the Romans, whose civilization described one huge parallelogram that blended belief in family and militarism. Familialismus, militarism, that is the principle of Roman culture. The secret to the success of Roman culture, like any other decidedly military culture, was that it created a war technology, the principle behind which could be termed the moral taming of the major stress response in the face of contemporary threats to life. And there is no need to explain that people in leisurely situations are capable of cooperation. By contrast, there is every need to explain the phenomenon that men cooperate under conditions of maximum stress. That means pursue joint goals in battle and when death is at their shoulder. Cultural theory shows that this presumes a large number of moral injunctions. For instance, the categorical prohibition of cowardice, which, by the way, has disappeared in Europe. So we have deconstructed the male self within a couple of decades. Cultural idealizations as heroism, polymogenous external relations, images of an enemy, and technical preparation exercises in the use of weapons and core drill. And everything would suggest that the phenomenon of maximum stress cooperation can be considered to be the key to the successful survivors of cultures. At the same time, we must concede that such a form of cooperation constitutes a paradoxical phenomenon of domestication. This can be seen from the act of military drill, which places the most fierce of biological processes, that means the greatest stress response, into the service of strategic goals. And anyone thinking about the continuation of man's self-domestication and its integration into overarching communities of solidarity must therefore address the question whether the traditional culture-defining forms of maximum stress cooperation can actually be overcome. And this is my last chapter under the title, Taming the Wild Animal Culture. Here we can see a fourth meaning of self-domestication emerging, and with it a new stage of the solidarity phenomenon. Having spoken of man's taming and domestication, first by political pedagogy, then by neotenic juvenilization, and finally by internalization of the symbolic orders, the phenomenon of military drilling of stress responses focuses our attention on a highly technical version of the domestication problem. Pacifism, if elaborated in anthropological terms, cannot rest content with the relational individual moving from the house of the family or the people into the house of God or Dharma, or joining the invisible people of the wise. These morally discerning movements lead into a critical scenario to martyrdom, to the extent that the latter means providing proof of the conviction that it is better to allow oneself to be killed than to continue to show solidarity with a murdering cultural group. So from the perspective of cultural theory, it bears assessing whether this exceptional form of non-cooperation with maximum stress cooperators can be transformed into a rule that can be observed universally. This assessment leads to a positive result, although the attendant difficulties remain very great. If we should understand cultures as themselves non-domesticated systems of domestication, or as systems of solidarity that show one another no solidarity, then any interest in higher order domestications can only be satisfied by a revision of the previous design of cultures as polemical survival units. In this context, the concept of solidarity has a specifically transcultural tone. The work of taming the wild animal of culture unfolds in three stages in keeping with the nature of the beast. The first is reached when, through mimetic approximation of one another, several survival units reach such a point that they can keep one another in check. Now, although this does not enable them to achieve internal domestication and demilitarization, mutual détente ensures containment. And this creates the precondition for subsequent advances in civilizing. At this stage of relations between ethnic groups and between states, diplomacy arises as the art of well-tempered animosity. It is obvious that under this regime there can be no excluding relapses. The reason being that in many places the equations of culture with survival units remain in force. Logically, the second stage of the containment of polymogenous cultures entailed their transformation into interdependent systems. Here, the cultures render their vital interests so dependent on interaction with partners in alien cultures that you can speak of the emergence of a higher order survival unit. This can at present be best observed in the economically networked democratic nations in the West, between whom the probability of bellicose regression has become minimal. In this instance, the domestication effect is exerted by the reformatting of the intuitively conceived survival unit. You still believe that your people is your survival unit, but from a systemic point of view, the system of nations in which you are integrated is a real survival unit, even if sometimes some parts of the population refuse to understand that. And this transgresses its prior outer limits and thus makes the previous enemy or rival a cooperator who himself has a survival edge thanks to the greater unit. And the most impressive example of this process can be seen in the historically singular structure of the European community, which, against a bellicose background that is not in the all too distant past, has, by means of a fascinating progress of self-containment, transformed itself into a higher stage political domestication unit. And this third stage of domestication of the wild animal, that is culture, would be reached at the moment when the large, internally domesticized survival units, which have been called civilizations, using Samuel Huntington's terminology, the West, Islam, India, China, Africa, Latin America, in turn then develop such a degree of affirmed interdependence among one another that they too move beyond the stage of non-domesticity in their external relations. There are undeniably tendencies that point in this direction. However, they do not lead beyond the stage of reciprocal containment, and there is still a lot of diplomacy needed, which always means that there are still remnants of warfare in the air. And likewise, there is no overlooking the fact that immense conflicts arise along the fault lines between the major units, in particular along the Sino-American and the Occidental Islamic fronts. The clashing cultural blocks are a far cry from effectively moving in under a shared civilizing roof. As regards the major units' external relationships, they cannot yet be any talk of the law of the excluded emergency case that governs internal civilizing processes. Indeed, even containment itself is repeatedly questioned, not least by the tragic dual role played by the monopolar world power, the United States of America. While it had subscribed to a global civilizing mission, it is at the same time pursuing crude regional policies in only its own interests that essentially deny its own ideals. It offers the drama of a civilization that takes the stage as both domesticator and wild animal. And in this way, the United States discredits in a very dangerous way those ideas, the credibility of which should be maintained at any price if the ongoing civilizing of the individual cultures is to move beyond the level of polemic containment. I have to stop here. I just add the remark that Americans, as we just heard, do not really recognize a limit to their way of life, because they are on an anthropological level deeply convinced that in every human being is hidden an American that wants to be free, set free. So thank you.